Alrighty, squad, we're back live. Actually, we're never live. I don't know why I ever say that, but this discussion we are going to talk about, dive into. I'm gonna do the Michael Phelps warm up. I whacked my finger. That kind of hurt. But I'm gonna talk about the dermis here, which is deeper than the epidermis. So there's two layers of the dermis. There's the papillary layer and reticular layer. Papillary layer is closer to the epidermis, so we got the epidermis, got the papillary layer, and then the rest of the dermis is the reticular layer. But the papillary layer is what we're going to talk about right now. It's thinner than the reticular layer, and it is composed of primarily areolar tissue. So it has that areolar tissue, that connective tissue, to supply nutrients to the epidermis there. There's these things called dermal papillae, which is right at the bottom of the epidermis, at the point of connection between the epidermis and the dermis. It's kind of like a squiggly line of sorts, but these dermal papillae, they are composed of nerves and blood vessels as well to help supply nutrients to that epidermis, which is avascular. So these dermal papillae, they poke up, if you will, into the epidermis to provide nutrients, and they do have nerves as well. So also things called epidermal ridges in the dermis here. It's when the dermis pushes up into the epidermis, and it forms ridges on the skin. So this allows us to grip things, and also in addition to the grip, so obviously this dermis is much smaller, it pushes together and it creates these little ridges on top of the skin. Allows us to grip things, and this is actually, believe it or not, which forms fingerprints on our, so whenever we fingerprint, hopefully when we don't go to jail here, fingerprints, that is, they're testing or recording, if you will, the epidermal ridges. So pretty interesting stuff. So that's the papillary layer. Now we're going to talk about the reticular layer of the dermis. So the reticular layer is composed of mostly dense irregular tissue. So papillary is primarily areolar tissue, and then this thicker part of the dermis, the reticular, is composed of mostly dense irregular tissue. There functions in strength, functions in support, and it does provide support for associative organs of the integumentary system. So that's the hair, the nail, and the glands. So we got the papillary, which has the dermal papillae and epidermal ridges. Then there's reticular layer. That's the support for the associative organs there. So it kind of keeps everything, gives lots of strength, lots of support. So those are two layers of the dermis. There's also some cells of the dermis. So the cells of the epidermis, just a reminder, are keratinocytes, melanocytes, Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells. On the other hand, the cells of the dermis are fibroblasts, which produce fibers, so the collagenous fibers, reticular fibers, elastic fibers. Think of a fibroblast as like a baker that produces a bunch of different desserts. So these fibroblasts, produce fibers, but it could be collagenous fibers, could be reticular fibers, could be elastic fibers. So fibroblast is one cell of the dermis. Another cell of the dermis is adipocytes. They store lipids. So think of it's like adipocytes is like the flash drive for energy. So it stores these lipids, which eventually can be used for energy once we use up our glycogen stores in the body. So we got the fibroblast, adipocytes. Also have macrophage is the third cell of the dermis. So the macrophage, they eat damaged tissue and pathogens. Think of a macrophage as kind of like the garbage man. So they just, or the Pac-Man garbage man. They just pathogens, virus, damaged tissue, and I think you get the point there. So fibroblasts, adipocytes, macrophage. Also got plasma cells in the dermis. They produce antibodies. So kind of like the personal assistant of the immune system. So this helps keep our bodies clean of disease and just help us fight against any infection that's in our body. So a very important aspect of our immune system and our immunity is the plasma cells of the dermis here. So those obviously aid in protection. Mast cells are the last cell of the dermis we're going to discuss. So mast cells, they produce and secrete heparin and histamine. So heparin is an anticoagulant, so it prevents blood clotting. So it's aka maybe a blood thinner if you want to call it that, but it's more precisely defined as an anticoagulant, so it prevents excess clotting of the blood. And then also produces and secretes histamine. Mast cells do. Histamine promotes inflammation, and we're going to talk about inflammation more in depth in the next video here. But cells of the dermis, we got the fibroblasts, adipocytes, the macrophage, plasma cells, and mast cells. Obviously, the macrophage, plasma cells, and mast cells do aid in protection of the body. Macrophage eats the damaged tissue. Plasma cells produces antibodies, which helps fight against infection. And mast cells, they do produce and secrete that heparin, which it prevents excess clotting. That helps protect us from getting a blood clot, obviously. And then histamine is produced and secreted, which promotes inflammation, which is actually it's a defense mechanism of our body whenever not in excess, which we're going to discuss in about 3 seconds in the next video. So 3, 2, 1.